Yeah, good morning and welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff, a brand new show designed to inform and bring you up to speed with some of the biggest stories happening in the world of sport first thing on your weekday morning. And today I'm joined by Julian de Stoop. G'day, Jules.
Hello, Pete. How you going?
Very well, mate. Fantastic to have you here. Let's rip straight into it. The 5 biggest stories making waves this morning. And we'll start with afl.com.au. Riley Beveridge with a story there regarding the likelihood of big crowds returning in Western Australia for the AFL competition, talking about up to 60,000 fans being back in Optus Stadium by round 7, which isn't far away. Also the possibility of hubs, Victorian teams travelling over to Western Australia. A couple of thoughts from you on this. Firstly, how exciting will it be to see full stadiums back in the AFL? And secondly, with the steps backwards that Victoria's had in a COVID sense over the last few days, does this make sense that perhaps we might actually see an AFL Grand Final shift its way over to Perth?
Yeah, firstly, look, I think it's fantastic for the players, in particular, that there will be crowds. And it was a great announcement from Western Australia. As you mentioned, round 7 is not that far away. We're going into round 4 this week. I think we've seen over the first few weeks, I think there's a couple of teams struggling without crowds being there. I think a team like the Tigers that are used to playing in front of 70, 80,000, they've been up there for 3 years. I think they're lacking that emotion of not having a crowd. And I know it's not at the MCG, but playing in front of 30,000 and then 60,000 at Optus will get the juices flowing. In terms of the grand final, I can't believe I'm saying this as a Victorian that certainly believes the grand final should always be at the MCG, given the tradition, the fact that it gets the most people in, and that's what we should be doing on a grand final. I think this year, of course, it makes perfect sense. With what's happened in Victoria, with the restrictions coming back on, we've basically got 6 councils in lockdown. All this optimism about crowds returning potentially in July, that's gone now, and we don't know when we're going to be able to have crowds back at the football. So it makes perfect sense to me. If you can only have 10 to 20,000 at the MCG compared to 60,000 at Optus Stadium, you've got to play it at Optus Stadium. You've got to maximise attendance for a grand final. Only a one-off, but certainly I think it's feasible this year.
Now, for those watching on video, you'll see I'm holding up the golden strainer. That's our way of making sure that we don't dwell on things for too long so that we fire out a nice, short, sharp update for you this morning. So that's my incredibly rude way of wrapping things up there. Move to our next topic. We're going to stick in the hub kind of space because an announcement through the NRL that the Melbourne Storm are going to have to relocate to Sydney and play their game against the Warriors at Cogra this weekend. Possibility that they'll then have to stay in a hub within New South Wales or even within Queensland. We've seen teams in Queensland and the AFL struggling to post results in that hub environment. What would this do for the Melbourne Storm's premiership ambitions?
Look, it'd certainly make it tougher, but I don't think you could write off a club like the Melbourne Storm. They're so well led by Craig Bellamy and Cameron Smith that I think they're one of the clubs that will be able to handle it. But in saying that, like you say, you see what's happened to the West Coast Eagles in the AFL, one of the real premiership favourites. They're emotionally, they're not there at the moment. They've got a lot of players with young kids that they're clearly struggling being away from home, particularly not knowing when they're coming back. And I guess unlike Fremantle that are up there as well, they're in a premiership window, so they can just see their time slipping away. So I wouldn't write off the Melbourne Storm, but it's certainly, obviously, it's going to make things tough if you're on the road. Like the West Coast Eagles, there's quite a few players at the Melbourne Storm with young families. And I think being away is one thing, but not knowing when you're coming back makes it even more difficult. So, yeah, I wouldn't write them off, but it certainly will make things a lot tougher if they have to spend several weeks away from Melbourne.
That story and all the details via the Daily Telegraph, Paul Crawley and Gilbert Gardner from the Herald Sun contributing there. Our third story this morning, Dominic Bossy writes in the Sydney Morning Herald some potentially fantastic news for football in the 2023 Women's FIFA World Cup bid for Australia and New Zealand, with Japan pulling out of the race ahead of Friday morning our time. The announcement being made there, it's a straight shootout between Australia and Colombia. For the sake of the argument here, let's say Australia does, or Australia and New Zealand do get the hosting rights. What type of legacy does that leave for women's football, and how big is that for us as a country?
I think it's massive, Pete. I mean, as we saw last week, and I heard you mention it yesterday, the Matildas were voted our most popular sporting team. And look, I mean, since the 2000 Olympics, we have hosted some massive events, a Rugby World Cup, a Cricket World Cup a few years back, but football is truly the global sport. So I think it's massive for women's sport. It's massive for women's football. But I think for football, in general in Australia, this would just be huge. The game needs a massive shot in the arm. We know the A-League is struggling. Thankfully, Fox Sports has signed on for another year, but that was pretty precarious for a while. So this would be huge. I remember covering this story when the bid was first announced. And I got the feeling that day that most people thought Japan were probably the red-hot favourite to secure this. Australia were a chance, but they were going to have to do something pretty extraordinary to topple Japan. So that news that Japan has pulled out is a massive shot in the arm for the bid. Fingers crossed it goes our way. But yeah, I think it would be the most significant event we've held on these shores. We saw what the Women's Cricket World Cup did earlier this year, but I think this would top that. Fingers crossed if the bid is successful.
Fingers crossed indeed. Of course, Japan pulling out will certainly help from an Asian bloc voting. It looks like we'll need 9 votes from North America, Europe, Africa, South America. We're unlikely to get any there, but with that Asian and Oceanic bloc hopefully pretty locked in now. We'll watch this with absolute interest. Our penultimate story this morning, we looked at the Australian and the broadsheet newspaper this morning. Peter Lawler covering the cricket, the latest ongoings there, and he's got some insight into an internal call which happened with Cricket Australia staff yesterday. Chairman Earl Eddings hosing down any speculation that Cricket Australia took a big hit on the stock market during the COVID pandemic. We've seen Kevin Roberts depart as chief executive last week. We've seen a great deal of uncertainty around the financial situation of Cricket Australia. And I ask you, Jules, the downsizing, the job cuts, has Cricket Australia taken advantage of the pandemic as an opportunity to actually make some reductions they wanted to make in the first instance?
I think potentially that is right. And maybe they had to. It's interesting with cricket because unlike the football codes that we've seen here in Australia, particularly the rugby league and the Aussie rules, that their fixture hasn't really been affected that much. I mean, in terms of they got their summer away internationally, Big Bash, Women's World Cup. And look, I don't think we're going to have the 2020 World Cup, but that was an ICC event. So Cricket Australia didn't stand to make that much money from that. It looks like, hopefully, we're going to get our test summer away with India. So in terms of lost revenue on fixtures, there's not that much there, but they're in such a financial hole that they clearly had to downsize. And being around the Cricket Australia office before, you do get the sense there is a lot of people working there. So maybe it's a good opportunity for them to downsize. It's massive. You know, cricket in Australia is so big. There's so many levels now with future tours, under-19s, local cricket, the women's cricket getting so much stronger. So it is a big concern, the financial hole they're in. And unfortunately, I think they just had to downsize. And like we've seen across the industry, it's very sad for a lot of good people that have lost their jobs. But given they didn't lose that much fixturing-wise, it has been a bit of a surprise how much of a financial hole Cricket Australia is in.
And it must be said, I think we've seen across all sports that, you know, administration numbers will never be the same again. Clearly, all sporting organisations, whether it's governing bodies, whether it's clubs, are going to operate with leaner staff. It's just whether Cricket Australia, as you say, not losing a lot of revenue, whether their job cuts have been slightly opportunistic. We'll move on to our big one. This is a story I know you wanted to spend double the time on today. It's a developing story. It's a big story around Essendon in the AFL. Sam McClure writes alongside Jake Niall in The Age today that the Essendon Football Club are looking to have their match against Carlton postponed if the COVID-19 positive test of Connor McKenna sees a number of other Essendon players ruled out this week. They only want the game against Carlton to go ahead if they have close to a full squad available for selection. Is that reasonable from Essendon, or do they just need to accept the situation and get on with it?
Look, I think it's reasonable to ask the question. So it appears like it's going to be obviously Connor McKenna unavailable and maybe only 5 other players. So I think that's okay to play the game. And look, we just have to keep the games going. I mean, we've only had 2 rounds and we've already had 1 game postponed. So since Connor McKenna's test on the weekend, we've seen what's happened in Victoria now. New South Wales and Queensland are recommending people don't travel to Victoria. If things get worse, they might shut the borders. So in all possibility, we're going to see other games postponed throughout the season. So we just need to get away as many games as possible. It's a bit unfair on Essendon. It's tough, but if it's only 5 players, they can still win this game against Carlton on the weekend. And they've been through worse before. I mean, they went through a whole season in 2016 without 12 of their best players. So it's for 1 week. It's harsh. Now, the players have been in quarantine since Saturday. Now, they're due to play Collingwood the following week on the Friday night. I think in terms of fairness, what the AFL will do there is move that fixture from Friday to Sunday. All those players would come out of quarantine the day before. So that would give them the chance to have a fuller strength side against Collingwood. In saying that, if players have done nothing for 2 weeks, they might not be ready to play. So it's a little bit tough on Essendon. I can see why they're asking the question, but in terms of just keeping this season moving, and particularly what's happened with the last 2 or 3 days in Victoria, we've got to avoid postponing games as long as we can. So it's tough on the Bombers, but I think it's fair that they play the Blues on Saturday night.
And a quick thing to note there as well, obviously, the changing of restrictions announced by the AFL yesterday. So no teams are going to be doing full group, full contact sessions at the moment anyway. We'll watch this space with absolute interest. Jules, you know we're recording early in the morning when I get my Conor McGregors and my Conor McKennas confused, but that's the
we all do that one.
That's it. That's the very intention of the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff, that we scour the papers, we do the hard work for you so that you can listen or watch this on your commute, in the shower, at the gym, and save yourself a bit of time in the morning. Before I let you go, mate, what's your one to watch in the sporting world today?
I think it's this Essendon story. I mean, we're going to get the names of it sounds like 5 players, and there was a big talk that it was going to be all of the back line basically wiped out for the Bombers this week. I don't think that's the case. I think it's a spread of players. But once those 5 players are named, I think we can all get our head around what sort of side the Bombers will take. And one of the great rivalries is Essendon and Carlton, and generally the underdog gets up in this one. So don't write off the mighty Bombers come Saturday night at the MCG against one of their great rivals, the Blues. Fantastic.
Julian de Stoop, thank you so much for joining us on the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. It's a brand new show. We're looking forward to having you back again moving forward. Of course, we've got a different journalist joining us every morning, Monday to Friday. Thanks very much, mate. Have a fantastic day.
You too, Pete. Look forward to it.